Our society, in fact at least partly the world, derives its sense of value, I believe, if not wrongly, then certainly it shouldn't be universal in that it is derived from wealth. Although I would suspect many would agree with me in this sentiment, those few who dissent, I ask to think of an individual who you believe to be objectively affluent or wealthy. Thinking about such an individual, I now ask you to consider why you consider them affluent or, again, wealthy. I'll give you a few moments to consider. Now, likely your reasoning is heavily reliant upon such things as that they are either in a position or indeed in place to accept or possess certain things, persons, or forces, such as it may be trust, grace, or high favor, or any such example. I point you to the knowledge of such things, if not themselves, then certainly when accounted in such a manner that they are considerations of wealth rather than considerations of the values themselves, or in that they are considered to be valuable in that they are a collection of things, rather than in some locations where such things are considered in a different manner, in which they are considered valuable on reasons other than their ability to create wealth. One such example, which can be very obvious, especially to those in more Western styles of thought, would be various Asian cultures, such as one of them being the Japanese. Before being more invested within Western views, as happened in more later centuries, the Japanese were heavily invested in a significantly different society than that which we consider such within the West. Within the Japanese culture, although an individual may in fact find themselves quite affluent, they may also simultaneously be considered within or on the proverbial chopping block, as it were, because within such a society it is not the affluence of an individual, but in fact their honor, which determines their status of societal highness, or in fact virtue. Within a military context, what might be considered a strategistic retreat in more Western circles could easily, within Japanese societies, be considered a dishonorable cowardice, and as such be seen, instead of, in the Western context, of preserving as much wealth or resources as possible, be seen as a dishonor, and therefore something which the society would rightly shun. One more obvious Western example of this such would be the equivalent to burning money, or if the money is more metal in its form, it would be the equivalent to simply throwing it within a waste bin. It would be seen as wholly destructive to the desire of any rational individual. With the consideration of such knowledge that it is not only affluence or wealth which can determine a society's value structure, and indeed even the Asian example of the Japanese I had given is only one such of many. I would implore you, the listener, to consider in truth the necessity of any society to earnestly view such things as wealth as the basis of value and of virtue within it, and such that any society which could truly be called a utopia to have as its base a sense of virtue derived from that of wealth, affluence, and other such desires of its individuals, or indeed if it could have such a basis and still be called such a utopia. I thank you for considering this intellectual, conceptual idea of a societal utopia. Final note, I made this episode as perhaps an example of evidence of how I am not, although it may seem such, a anti-intellectual hillbilly who's dead set on rambling on topics he couldn't possibly have the slightest understanding of, but simply that it is my preferred method of intellectual discourse. In that the hillbillies discussing such things as sports or local politics, I find to be the most valuable method of, as I said, intellectual discourse. In my imaginings, when I make these videos on the Hasemage channel, formerly Kazasui, but thankfully Hasemage now, I would make them imagining myself as simply the individual sitting around the campfire with several other individuals, the viewers, and that simply it was my turn to ramble about the general topic of the day. Now, the topics would not fit within that crowd, but that is the place where I imagine myself. As if you want to think of it more intellectually, I imagine myself perhaps as a Greek with other Greeks sitting around a table at a party that the Greeks were famous for, simply discussing the philosophies and considering truths. And it would only be my turn, and that ideally there would be, although the videos would be significantly longer, there would be several other individuals to give their input. I know that there are several dialogues written by, I believe, Plato, involving individuals such as Socrates and other Greek philosophers discussing truths. In fact, at one point I listened to a podcast in which they discussed, I forgot precisely what it was called, but it was a party thrown in honor of someone, and there was Socrates, Plato, or at least Socrates and Aristotle, I believe, and several other Greek philosophers discussing, I think it was love, or perhaps desire in the context of love. That is the situation, or although in my mind it's more as the hillbillies sitting around a campfire, of how I view myself discussing these topics. I made this video, though, to show how I am actually capable of a purely intellectual video, giving an intellectual proposal and allowing it for consideration of the viewer. Although, and trust me, the notes I had for this, of which there are several pages, that is, are a lot more intellectually thick, shall we say. But it really just comes down to the fact that I couldn't earnestly say that. Is what it was coming down to. I tried a couple of times. The first few takes of this video were me attempting to stick to the dialogue itself, but I couldn't. I'm just not that kind of person who can go purely intellectual. My considerations of such things are inevitably conversations, which is shown by such things as my prefacing my statements with, I'm probably wrong about this, but in my view, although I try to keep that out of videos as much as possible, just because of the redundance of it. The thing is, I wanted to show in this, well, now seeming to be first half of this video, that I am actually capable of this purely intellectual dialogue. but I wanted to show also, in comparison to my other videos, how this conversation method is, at least, I hope that many of you will see that it is a more preferable method of discourse, and how ideally, when discussing in this method, especially if there's other individuals present, that an intellectual discussion can get done much more succinctly. One example I actually want to point you to as sort of what I consider the middle ground between pure intellectual discourse and a group of hillbillies sitting around a campfire would be the podcast, which I've actually found very fun to listen to for the last few years, and that's the Partially Examined Life podcast. For any of you who watch my philosophy series, this should be at least vaguely interesting to you. It's several, I guess it's best to call them semi-intellectuals, or at least semi-scholars. They're all intellectuals, I think, but semi-scholars discussing more or less philosophical concepts, although they sometimes stray into what I would consider more on the politics section of my videos. Generally politics is more rare for them, especially in the earlier episodes. So I consider what they do as more or less what I'm attempting to do, which is several people sitting around a table, or sitting around a Skype call, but effectively a table, and discussing a topic of life and how much validity it has to the real life in which people live. So yes, this video was, to conclude this video, I guess I'll say that if you truly preferred that that speech, I suppose I could say, that lecture I just gave on why society should, if not necessarily be, why a utopia should not necessarily be disqualified, if it is one which bases its values on economic standards, then it should certainly be considered to be only one possibility amongst several good ones. So in this, it would be, I guess I'm trying to explain here that this is why I do my videos like this. If I did it if you preferred what I just did, maybe you shouldn't be going to my channel for this kind of stuff. That said, maybe you should, because I still try and spice a little more, shall we say, intellectualism in my videos than I usually do in my everyday speech, but not a lot. And usually that is mostly taken up in the fact that I don't just use little words. Well, I don't do that in my everyday speech, but, you know, well, anyways, these videos are a drop more professional than simply me talking to another individual unrecorded would be. Well, anyways, hopefully this wasn't a wasted example, but if it was, so be it. It was fun to write anyways. So, oh, yeah, I guess, I don't know why you wouldn't believe me that I have notes, but anyways, here it is, evidence. These are several pages. So yeah, this video, if nothing else, was purely planned out. Well, okay, maybe not the last 5 minutes, but it was highly planned out in comparison to the other videos, which usually have maybe 1 or 2 pages of a rough outline. So, yeah, this is a society episode, so it's general. Well, maybe I should have made this as a vlog. Whatever, it's a society intro episode. Enjoy the generalized outro.